The dawn of change. Ashwood, a quaint southern town, often basked in the golden glow of its picturesque mornings. A stillness hung over its streets on Sundays, broken only by the faint hum of life stirring behind curtains, the clink of coffee cups, and the low murmur of church bells. Yet beneath this tranquil facade, tension brewed, a quiet undercurrent of prejudice that had yet to fade entirely from the town's collective consciousness. Joe Thompson, an 82-year-old black veteran, began his day in a modest home on the outskirts of Ashwood. The house, worn but well-loved, reflected a life of resilience. Each creaking floorboard and sun-bleached photograph told a story. Joe, with his silver hair and deeply lined face, moved through his morning routine with the careful precision of a man accustomed to meeting challenges head-on. The small bedroom he shared only with memories was a gallery of his life, a faded photo of him as a young soldier, standing tall in his crisp uniform, hung above his dresser. Below it rested a folded American flag in a wooden case, a testament to his decades of service. He paused in front of the mirror, studying the reflection staring back at him. The weight of his years bore down on his shoulders, but his eyes, though clouded, retained their youthful fire. As he reached for the military jacket adorned with medals, symbols of valor earned in battles both foreign and domestic, a pang of emotion rippled through him. He thought of the friends he'd lost, the sacrifices they'd made, and the ideals they had fought to uphold. The jacket felt heavier than usual that morning, as if foreshadowing the trials to come. Straightening his tie, he took one final glance in the mirror before donning his cap, the insignia shining despite its age. Joe's destination that morning was the Cozy Corner Café, a small establishment nestled in the heart of Ashwood. Known for its home-style cooking and cheery ambience, the café had long intrigued Joe. His usual haunt was closed for renovations, so he decided it was the perfect opportunity to try something new. As he walked the familiar streets, his neighbors greeted him with varying degrees of warmth. He smiled at those who waved and nodded politely at the ones who avoided eye contact. Prejudice, he had learned, was often cloaked in politeness. The Cozy Corner stood out with its charming white facade, painted shutters, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Where everyone's welcome." Joe appreciated the sentiment, though he knew better than to take such words at face value. Pushing open the door, he was greeted by the cheerful chime of a bell and the intoxicating aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon. The place buzzed with morning chatter, the clink of cutlery, and bursts of laughter from a table of children. Joe took it all in, the mismatched chairs, the chalkboard menu with whimsical drawings, and the hum of life that gave the cafe its name. A young waitress, Sarah, approached him with a radiant smile. Her auburn hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, and her name tag was slightly askew. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to the Cozy Corner. Table or counter?" she asked brightly. Joe smiled, her warmth a balm to his guarded heart. "A table, if you've got one by the window." "Right this way," she said, leading him to a cozy booth bathed in sunlight. As Joe settled in, Sarah handed him a menu. "Can I get you started with coffee?" "Please," Joe replied, his voice rich and steady. As Sarah bustled away, he glanced around. Families chatted over pancakes, a couple shared a newspaper, and in the corner, a group of bikers laughed heartily. Their leather jackets and tough demeanor were at odds with the cheerful setting, yet they seemed entirely at ease. Joe turned his attention to the menu, the enticing descriptions making his stomach growl. Before he could decide, Sarah returned with a steaming mug of coffee. "Ready to order, or need a minute?" "I think I'll have the special," Joe said, folding the menu. "Scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast." "Great choice," Sarah replied. "Our scrambled eggs are the best in town." As Sarah walked away, Joe took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth and depth of flavor. The moment of peace was shattered when the kitchen door swung open, and a man emerged. Balding and broad-shouldered, the man surveyed the room with the confident air of someone used to being in charge. His name tag read Frank. Joe noticed the man's demeanor change as their eyes met. The welcoming expression Frank wore moments ago evaporated, replaced by a scowl that made Joe's stomach tighten. Frank made a beeline for Joe's table, his steps deliberate, and his gaze cold. "We're full up," Frank said flatly, his arms crossed. "You'll have to leave." Joe blinked, glancing at the empty tables around him. "I don't mean to trouble you, but it seems there's plenty of room." Frank's jaw tightened. "We'd reserve the right to refuse service to anyone." The cafe fell silent. All eyes turned to the confrontation. Joe met Frank's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "I've served this country for over 30 years, he said, his voice low but firm. "I've earned the right to sit here and enjoy a meal." Frank's face flushed. "Not here, you haven't. Your kind isn't welcome." The word struck Joe like a blow, but he stood his ground, his hand resting on the edge of the table. The room seemed to hold its breath. In the corner, the bikers exchanged glances, their laughter replaced by a tense silence. Joe squared his shoulders, the weight of his medals grounding him. "I'm not looking for trouble. I just want breakfast." Before Frank could respond, the leader of the bikers, a tall man with a graying beard, rose from his seat. His movements were slow, deliberate, as he approached the table. He placed a firm hand on Frank's shoulder and said in a voice that carried across the room, "Maybe it's time you reconsider who's really unwelcome here." The room erupted into murmurs. Joe turned to face the man, surprise and curiosity warring in his expression. In the unexpected presence of allies, a spark of hope flickered to life. The allies in leather. The cozy corner cafe, once buzzing with cheerful Sunday morning activity, now stood in a pregnant silence. The sound of clinking cutlery and murmured conversations had ceased as all eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. Frank, the cafe owner, stood frozen, his mouth agape as the leader of the biker group. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding quiet authority, stepped forward. "Frank," the biker said evenly, his voice calm but laced with an edge that carried unspoken weight. "You've got a lot of explaining to do." Frank's bravado faltered. His hands trembled slightly, but he attempted to mask it by crossing his arms. "This is my place," he spat, his voice wavering as he pointed at Joe. "I decide who stays and who doesn't." The biker leader, who introduced himself as Mike, folded his arms, his stance steady and unyielding. Behind him, the other bikers rose one by one, their leather jackets gleaming under the soft glow of the cafe's lights. Each man's face carried a story, etched in weathered lines and scars. There was no mistaking their unity. "Is that right?" Mike said, tilting his head slightly as if challenging Frank to repeat himself. "You reserve the right to discriminate, huh? Against a man who's probably done more for this country than you ever have." Frank's eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but the patrons remained quiet, their expressions ranging from discomfort to quiet outrage. Even Sarah, the young waitress who had been serving Joe with a warm smile moments before, stood frozen near the counter, her knuckles white, as she gripped her notepad. Joe sat back in his booth, his hand resting on the table to steady himself. He was no stranger to confrontation, but the unexpected show of solidarity from the bikers left him both touched and cautious. He wasn't sure where this was headed, but he knew the tides were shifting. "Look," Frank began, his voice faltering, "this has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Mike interrupted, stepping closer. His voice dropped, but the intensity remained. "Let me tell you something about your kind, Frank. You're the kind that sits back and benefits from the sacrifices of men like this one." He gestured toward Joe, who remained stoic. "And then you spit on them when you think no one's looking." A low murmur rippled through the cafe. The bikers behind Mike nodded in agreement, their presence casting an imposing shadow over the room. One of them, a younger man with a shaved head and a tattoo peeking out from beneath his collar, stepped forward. "You're looking at a room full of veterans," the man said, his voice tinged with both pride and anger. "We've served with people of every race, every background. We bled together, fought together, and some of us died together. You don't get to tell this man he doesn't belong." Frank took a step back, his face flushing with a mix of fear and anger. "You can't just come in here and—" "We can, and we will," another biker interjected, his voice booming. He was an older man with a silver beard and piercing blue eyes, his stance as solid as a mountain. "You don't treat people like that. Not in this town. Not anywhere." Joe felt a lump rise in his throat. For years, he had fought his battles in quiet solitude, enduring the slights and outright hostilities with a resilience born of necessity. But here were men, strangers, standing up for him with a fierceness that left him both humbled and astonished. Frank, however, wasn't ready to back down. "This is harassment," he said, his voice rising in desperation. "I'll call the police." Mike smirked, crossing his arms. "Go ahead. Call them. Let them come down here and see what you've done. You think the badge will side with you when they hear how you threw out a veteran for no reason?" Frank's face turned beet red. His lips parted as if to retort, but no words came. His gaze darted to the cafe's windows, where passers-by had begun to gather. Curious faces peered through the glass, their expressions a mix of confusion and intrigue. Mike turned to Joe, his expression softening. "Sir, I hope you know you're not alone in this." "Not anymore." Joe nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I appreciate what you're doing. More than you know." One of the bikers, a wiry man with sharp features and a deep voice, spoke up. "This isn't just about you, sir. It's about every person who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Frank's been pulling stunts like this for years. It's time someone put a stop to it." A murmur of agreement spread through the cafe. Even some of the other patrons began nodding, emboldened by the biker's stand. Sarah stepped forward hesitantly, her cheeks flushed with nervousness. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm so sorry about what happened. It's not right and—" She glanced at Frank, her voice faltering. "It's not what this cafe should stand for." Joe gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you, Sarah. That means a lot." Mike turned back to Frank, his tone firm. "This is what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Mr. Thompson. Right here, right now. And you're going to think long and hard about the kind of place you're running." Frank's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse. But as he glanced around the room, at the bikers, the patrons, and the crowd growing outside, his defiance crumbled. With a heavy sigh, he turned to Joe. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Joe tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I didn't quite catch that." Frank's face darkened, but he repeated himself, louder this time. "I'm sorry." Joe nodded once, his gaze steady. "I accept your apology. But words mean little without action." Frank opened his mouth to reply, but Mike cut him off. "You heard the man. Actions speak louder than words. You've got some work to do, Frank, and we'll be watching." With that, Mike turned to Joe, extending a hand. "Sir, if you're ready, we'd like to buy you breakfast somewhere else, somewhere better." Joe hesitated, glancing at his unfinished coffee. The weight of the morning's events was heavy on his shoulders, but the solidarity in the room, the unexpected allies who had risen to his defense, lifted his spirits. He stood slowly, gripping Mike's hand firmly. "I think I'd like that," he said with a small smile. The bikers escorted Joe out of the cafe, their presence a shield against the hostility that had tried to root itself in Ashwood. The crowd outside parted to let them pass, whispers and murmurs following in their wake. As they walked down the street, Joe felt a strange sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't fighting it alone. Sparks of change. The sun climbed higher over Ashwood as Joe Thompson walked down the street flanked by the group of bikers. Their presence was both a comfort and a curiosity to the townspeople watching from storefronts and porches. The quiet southern town, known for its slow pace and whispered tensions, had suddenly become a stage for something far greater than itself. Joe adjusted his military jacket, the polished metals catching the sunlight. Despite the support surrounding him, he couldn't shake the complex emotions that swirled within him. Gratitude mingled with unease, pride warred with weariness. He had never sought the role of a trailblazer, but here he was, thrust into the spotlight. Mike, the leader of the bikers, broke the silence as they neared a small diner on the edge of town. Its bright red awning and cheerful welcome sign stood in stark contrast to the morning's events. "This place should do," he said, gesturing toward the entrance. "They've got good food and better people." Joe nodded, feeling the weight of his steps lessen as they crossed the threshold. The smell of fresh-baked biscuits and brewed coffee enveloped them, and a young waitress greeted them with a beaming smile. She didn't flinch at the sight of the bikers or Joe's military jacket. Instead, she grabbed menus and led them to a large booth without hesitation. "What can I get y'all started with?" she asked, her voice light and genuine. "Coffee for everyone," Mike said, nodding to the group. Then he turned to Joe. "Order whatever you want. This one's on us." Joe chuckled softly. "I appreciate that, but I don't need." "Think of it as thanks," Mike interrupted, "for everything you've done, for what you stand for." The sincerity in Mike's tone left Joe momentarily speechless. He nodded and ordered the special, a fitting meal for a day that had been anything but ordinary. As the group settled into their seats, the diner's atmosphere felt like a balm to the tension Joe had carried all morning. Laughter and murmurs of conversation floated through the air, blending with the clatter of dishes and the faint hum of a jukebox in the corner. It was a stark contrast to the heavy silence that had followed him out of the cozy corner. "Tell us about yourself, Mr. Thompson," one of the bikers said. It was the younger man with the tattooed forearm who had spoken up earlier at the cafe. His tone was respectful, almost reverent. "You've got stories, don't you?" Joe hesitated, his gaze drifting to the steaming mug of coffee in front of him. He wasn't used to being asked about his past, at least, not with genuine interest. But something about the group's earnest faces encouraged him. "Call me Joe," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And yeah, I got stories. Most of them ain't the kind you'd hear in a history book." The bikers leaned in, their attention unwavering, as Joe began to speak. He told them about his early years in Ashwood, where segregation had been the unspoken rule. He recounted his decision to join the military, driven by a desire to prove himself in a world that seemed determined to undervalue him. "I thought maybe wearing that uniform would change the way people saw me," Joe said, his voice softening. "And for a while, it did. When you're out there in the thick of it, fighting for your life, nobody cares what color your skin is. You're just a soldier." The bikers nodded, their own experiences reflected in Joe's words. Some of them had served in Vietnam, others in Iraq and Afghanistan. They understood the camaraderie that transcended race, religion, and background. But they also knew the harsh reality Joe described next. Coming home was a different story, Joe continued, his tone tinged with bitterness. "You'd think fighting for your country would earn you some respect, but it didn't. At least, not for me. I came back to the same small minds and closed doors I'd left behind." The table fell silent, the weight of Joe's words sinking in. Mike broke the quiet with a low, steady voice. "That's why we're here, Joe, because that kind of thing, it doesn't sit right with us. Not then, not now." Joe studied Mike's face, the weathered lines and piercing eyes. He saw no hesitation, no performative righteousness, just a man who believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. The group's conversation continued over plates of eggs, bacon, and toast. They laughed at lighter stories from Joe's past and grew somber when he shared the harder truths. As the meal wound down, Joe felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced in years. These men, despite their rough exteriors, had become allies in a fight he had long believed was his alone. When the plates were cleared and the coffee cups drained, Mike leaned back in his seat. "Joe, we've got plans," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something significant. Today wasn't just about standing up to Frank. It's about changing this town. Joe raised an eyebrow. His curiosity piqued. "What kind of plans?" Mike exchanged a glance with the other bikers, and a small smile tugged at his lips. "We're not just gonna let Frank get away with what he's been doing. But we're not here to start fights or cause trouble. We're gonna hit him where it hurts, his reputation and his wallet." Joe frowned, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "I don't want violence. I've seen enough of that in my life." Mike shook his head. "No violence, I promise. But we're not gonna let this slide, either. We've got a peaceful protest planned. We'll be outside his cafe every morning if we have to, making sure the whole town knows what kind of man he is." The other bikers nodded in agreement, their expressions resolute. Joe felt a pang of doubt. He didn't want to see Ashwood torn apart by division, but he also couldn't deny the power of their conviction. "Why are you doing this?" Joe asked after a moment, his voice tinged with both gratitude and disbelief. "You don't even know me." Mike's gaze softened. "We know enough. You're a veteran, a man who's given more to this country than most. That's enough for us." The sincerity in Mike's words left Joe speechless. He nodded slowly, his chest tightening with emotion he couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, he felt truly seen. As they left the diner, the bikers escorted Joe back to his home. Their motorcycles rumbled down the quiet streets, drawing curious stares from the townsfolk. Joe walked with a lighter step, the weight of the morning's events no longer pressing so heavily on his shoulders. When they reached his front porch, Mike extended a hand. "You've got allies now, Joe. You ever need anything, you let us know." Joe took his hand, gripping it firmly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." The bikers nodded, their engines roaring to life as they rode off into the afternoon sun. Joe stood on his porch, watching until they disappeared from view. The quiet of his home enveloped him, but this time, it didn't feel so lonely. As he stepped inside, Joe felt something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The events of the morning had shaken him, but they had also ignited a spark. Perhaps, he thought, change was possible. Perhaps Ashwood could become the place he had always hoped it would be. The quiet revolution. The following days in Ashwood were anything but ordinary. Joe Thompson's quiet life had been upended, and the ripple effects of his encounter at the cozy corner cafe had spread far beyond the small southern town. What began as a tense, isolated moment had become a flashpoint for deeper discussions, sparking a quiet revolution in the hearts and minds of its people. Joe rose early on Monday morning, the hum of yesterday's events still fresh in his mind. Standing at his kitchen window, he watched the sunlight streak through the trees. The neighborhood was as still as ever, but Joe could feel the undercurrent of change. A knock at his door startled him. When he opened it, he found Mike, the biker leader, standing on his porch, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Morning, Joe," Mike said, his voice carrying the easy confidence of a man accustomed to taking charge. "Morning," Joe replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you by so early?" Mike held up a newspaper, folded neatly under his arm. "Figured you might want to see this." Joe took the paper, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. Splashed across the front page was a picture of the cozy corner cafe, the line of motorcycles parked outside unmistakable. The headline read, "Veterans Stand Against Discrimination. Small-Town Protest Draws National Attention." Joe sank into his armchair, the weight of the moment settling over him. National attention, he murmured, almost to himself. Mike nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "The story's picking up steam. A couple of reporters were in town yesterday, and they've been spreading the word. People are talking, Joe. Not just about what happened to you, but about how things like this are still happening at all." Joe's stomach churned with unease. He hadn't intended to become the face of a movement. "I never wanted all this attention," he said, looking up at Mike. "I just wanted breakfast." Mike chuckled softly. "I know, Joe, but sometimes life has other plans. You've sparked something here, and people are paying attention. That's not a bad thing." Joe sighed, setting the newspaper on the table. He appreciated the support, but the weight of it all felt immense. "What happens now?" he asked. Mike's expression grew serious. "We're organizing. Peaceful protests, fundraisers, community events. The goal isn't just to hold Frank accountable, it's to show this town what real unity looks like. You'll see, this is bigger than one cafe or one bad day." The protest gains momentum. By midweek, the protests outside the Cozy Corner Café had grown into a full-blown movement. Each morning, a diverse crowd gathered, holding signs that read "Equality for All" and "Veterans for Justice." The bikers were always present, their imposing presence drawing both attention and admiration. Families joined in, young and old standing side by side to support the cause. Even local clergy showed up, lending their voices to the call for change. Joe, however, remained hesitant to attend. While he appreciated the solidarity, he struggled with the idea of being the center of it all. It wasn't until Mike appeared on his doorstep again, this time with a familiar young waitress in tow, that Joe reconsidered. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly, "I just wanted to say thank you." Joe tilted his head, confused. "For what?" "For standing up to Frank," she said. "He's been like that for as long as I've worked there. I've seen him turn people away before, but I was too scared to say anything. What you did, it gave me courage. I quit yesterday. I couldn't work for someone like him anymore." Joe blinked, taken aback. Sarah's words hit him harder than he expected. He had always believed his battles were his alone, but now he saw how his actions had inspired others to take a stand. "Thank you for telling me that," Joe said quietly. "It means more than you know." Mike clapped a hand on Joe's shoulder. "Come to the protest tomorrow, Joe. People need to see you. You don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but your presence alone will mean a lot." Joe hesitated, then nodded. "I'll be there." The turning point. The next morning, Joe stood at the edge of the growing crowd, his military jacket pristine and his medals gleaming in the sunlight. The sight before him was overwhelming. Dozens of people, neighbors, strangers, and families, stood united, their signs held high. The murmur of conversation was punctuated by occasional cheers and chants. The air buzzed with energy. As Joe stepped forward, the crowd parted, and a hush fell over the group. All eyes turned to him, their expressions a mix of admiration and respect. Mike stepped up beside him, his presence steadying. "Everyone," Mike called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. "This is Joe Thompson. He's the reason we're here today. But this fight isn't just about him. It's about what he represents: dignity, sacrifice, and the right to be treated with respect." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Joe felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this level of support, nor had he realized just how deeply his story had resonated with others. As the noise subsided, Joe cleared his throat. He hadn't planned to speak, but the moment compelled him. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I didn't ask for any of this, but seeing all of you here, it gives me hope. Hope that things can change. Not just for me, but for everyone." Applause rippled through the crowd, and for the first time in a long while, Joe felt truly seen. Not as a symbol, but as a man whose life and struggles mattered. Frank's reckoning. Inside the Cozy Corner Café, Frank watched the protest with a mixture of anger and despair. The once bustling business was now a shadow of its former self, the tables empty and the air stale. The boycott had taken its toll, and Frank knew he was losing. As the days turned into weeks, the protest continued. Frank found himself the subject of scorn and scrutiny, not just from the townspeople but from the media as well. His attempts to defend his actions only deepened the public's disdain. Eventually, Frank made a decision he never thought he would. On a quiet morning, he hung a "Closed for Business" sign in the window and locked the door for the final time. A new beginning. Months later, the space that once housed the Cozy Corner Cafe reopened under new ownership. The sign above the door now read, Patch and Stripes Cafe, a nod to both the bikers and the military. The interior had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space, adorned with photos of veterans and community members of all backgrounds. Joe was invited to cut the ribbon at the grand opening. As he stood before the crowd, flanked by Mike and Sarah, he couldn't help but smile. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led to this, a space that truly lived up to the words painted on its window, where everyone's welcome. Bridging divides. The opening of the Patch and Stripes Cafe was more than a celebration of a new business. It was a testament to the power of unity, resilience, and the courage to challenge old prejudices. The ribbon-cutting ceremony drew a crowd larger than any Ashwood had seen in years. Townsfolk, visitors from neighboring areas, and even reporters who had followed the story gathered to witness the culmination of months of transformation. Joe Thompson stood at the forefront, scissors in hand. Beside him were Mike, Sarah, and several of the bikers who had become his unlikely allies. Their presence was a visible reminder of the solidarity that had sparked the cafe's rebirth. As Joe cut the ribbon, the crowd erupted into cheers. A new chapter had begun, not just for the cafe, but for the town itself. Joe felt the weight of the moment settle over him like a warm embrace. The struggle had been long and painful, but standing here now, he could feel the tide turning, reclaiming a space. Inside, the cafe was unrecognizable. Gone were the old furnishings and the lingering air of exclusivity. In their place were inviting booths, walls adorned with framed photographs of veterans, and a large mural depicting a diverse group of people holding hands, standing against a backdrop of rolling hills. At the heart of the mural was a younger version of Joe, in uniform, standing tall. Joe stared at the mural, his throat tightening. He hadn't known about the artwork until that moment, and seeing himself depicted as a symbol of change was almost overwhelming. Mike clapped a hand on his shoulder. "It's a reminder," he said softly, "of what one man's courage can do." The cafe was alive with activity. People lined up to order, filling the space with laughter and conversation. Joe noticed families of all backgrounds sitting together, sharing meals and stories. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was cultural. The cafe had become a microcosm of what Ashwood could be, a community united by shared values rather than divided by differences. Job took a seat near the window, the same booth he had occupied on that fateful morning months ago. This time, the view outside was different. The protest signs were gone, replaced by smiling faces and bustling activity. It was a sight that filled him with cautious optimism. Frank's reflection. Meanwhile, Frank sat alone in his small apartment on the outskirts of town, nursing a cup of cold coffee. The closure of the Cozy Corner Cafe had left him bitter and resentful. He had avoided the grand reopening, unable to stomach the sight of his former business thriving under someone else's ownership. But Frank wasn't immune to the whispers of change sweeping through Ashwood. Friends and former patrons had shared stories about the new cafe and the sense of inclusivity it brought to the town. Frank didn't want to admit it, but part of him felt a pang of regret, not for losing his business, but for the way he had contributed to the divide. One evening, as he flipped through channels on his outdated television, he stumbled upon a news segment covering the cafe's transformation. The reporter interviewed patrons, many of whom spoke about how the cafe had become a symbol of unity and progress. Then the camera cut to Joe, who spoke with quiet dignity about the importance of standing up for what's right. Frank stared at the screen, the image of Joe, a man he had dismissed so callously, staring back at him. The words Joe spoke echoed in his mind long after the segment ended. Change doesn't happen all at once. It's a lot of small steps, but those steps add up. For the first time in months, Frank felt something stir within him, a faint glimmer of self-awareness. He knew he had a choice, to remain mired in bitterness or to take responsibility for his actions and try to make amends. The letter. A week later, Joe received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. He opened it cautiously, his curiosity piqued. The letter was short but heartfelt. Dear Mr. Thompson, I've spent a lot of time thinking about what happened at the cafe and the part I played in it. I know an apology can't undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that I regret my actions deeply. Watching what you and the others have done with the cafe has opened my eyes to the kind of person I want to be moving forward. I hope someday I'll have the chance to make things right. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to change. Sincerely, Frank. Joe read the letter twice. His emotions conflicted. Part of him wanted to dismiss it as too little, too late, but another part recognized the courage it took to admit wrongdoing. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table, deciding to let time reveal the sincerity behind Frank's words. A town transformed. As the weeks turned into months, Ashwood continued to evolve. The Patch and Stripes Café became more than just a place to eat. It became a gathering spot for the community. Town hall meetings, fundraisers, and cultural events were held there, each one drawing people from all walks of life. The bikers, once seen as outsiders, were now regarded as local heroes. Joe, too, found himself stepping into a new role. He was invited to speak at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned over a lifetime of perseverance. Each time, he emphasized the importance of empathy, courage, and standing up for what's right. One evening, after a particularly moving speech at the local high school, a young girl approached Joe. Her hair was braided, and she wore a denim jacket covered in pins. She looked up at him with wide eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she said shyly, "do you think things will ever really change?" Joe knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "Change takes time," he said gently. "It's not easy, and it's not always fast. But every step we take, no matter how small, brings us closer." The girl nodded, her expression thoughtful. As she walked away, Joe felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had fought many battles in his life, but perhaps this one, the battle for hearts and minds, was the most important of all. A glimmer of redemption. Months later, Frank walked through the doors of the Patch and Stripes Café. The room fell silent as people recognized him, their conversations pausing mid-sentence. Frank's face was drawn, his steps hesitant. He approached the counter, where Sarah now worked as the cafe's manager. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Thompson," Frank said, his voice subdued. Sarah glanced toward Joe, who was sitting in his usual spot near the window. Joe had noticed Frank's entrance, but had remained calm, waiting to see what would unfold. Sarah nodded and motioned for Frank to approach. Frank stood before Joe, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I'd wanted to thank you for everything you've done, for this place, for this town, and for giving me a chance to see things differently." Joe studied Frank's face for a moment before extending his hand. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said simply. Frank took Joe's hand, his grip firm but his expression contrite. The room remained quiet, the weight of the moment palpable. As Frank turned to leave, the quiet conversations resumed, their tone lighter than before. A legacy of hope. In the years that followed, Joe's story became a cornerstone of Ashwood's identity. The cafe flourished, and the town's reputation shifted from one of quiet prejudice to one of active progress. Visitors came from far and wide to see the mural, to hear Joe speak, and to experience the spirit of unity that had taken root. Joe, now in his mid-80s, often sat by the window of the cafe, watching the world go by. He would sip his coffee, greet old friends, and occasionally share a story with the patrons who came to seek his wisdom. And as the sun set over Ashwood each evening, it painted the town in golden hues, a reminder that even in the smallest places, great change is possible. The ties that bind. Years had passed since that fateful morning at the Cozy Corner Cafe, and Ashwood was no longer the town it had once been. Change, slow and deliberate, had reshaped its streets and its people. The Patch and Stripes Café remained a hub of life, its walls adorned with new photos and mementos from the community it had brought together. Joe Thompson, now in his late 80s, was as much a fixture of the café as the large mural of his younger self in uniform. On a crisp fall morning, Joe sat in his usual booth by the window, the sunlight casting a warm glow over the café. A cup of steaming coffee rested in his hands, and a notebook lay open on the table before him. He had taken to writing in recent years, capturing stories from his life for his grandchildren and for anyone willing to listen. His once steady hands trembled slightly now, but his mind was as sharp as ever. The café buzzed with activity. Families chatted over breakfast, students huddled over textbooks, and bikers exchanged laughter and stories in the corner booth they had claimed as their own. The air was thick with the smell of cinnamon rolls and freshly brewed coffee, a comforting aroma that spoke of warmth and welcome, a visitor from the past. The café door chimed, and a hush fell over the room as a familiar figure stepped inside. Frank, the former owner of the Cozy Corner, stood in the doorway, his hair now entirely gray and his posture less sure than it had been years ago. He carried a worn leather case, and his eyes scanned the room until they landed on Joe. Joe watched him approach, his expression calm but curious. Frank stopped a few feet away, clutching the case like a lifeline. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice softer than it had been during their last confrontation. "Do you have a moment?" Joe gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat, Frank." Frank sat down slowly, setting the leather case on the table. He looked around the café, his eyes lingering on the mural of Joe. "This place is different," he said, his tone wistful. "Better." Joe offered a small smile. "It's the people that make it what it is. A lot of them worked hard to build something they could be proud of." Frank nodded, his hands fidgeting with the latches of the case. "I've been thinking about what you said to me all those years ago," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "about actions speaking louder than words." Joe leaned back in his seat, studying Frank's face. The man before him was a shadow of the one he had faced in anger and defiance. "And what have you done with those words, Frank?" Frank swallowed hard, then opened the leather case. Inside were neatly organized documents, photographs, and a small black notebook. He pushed it across the table toward Joe. "This," Frank said, his voice breaking slightly, "is my apology." Joe hesitated before picking up the notebook. Inside, he found handwritten entries, stories of Frank's childhood, his struggles, and his prejudices. Each entry was raw, unflinching, and honest. "I started writing after the café closed," Frank explained. "I didn't know how else to make sense of what I'd done, of the way I'd lived my life. I wanted to understand, and to change." Joe turned the pages slowly, reading fragments of Frank's journey. He saw the pain of a man wrestling with his own shortcomings and the quiet determination to make amends. "There's more," Frank said, pointing to the documents in the case. "I've been volunteering at a veterans support group. It started small, just helping out with events, but over time, it became more than that. I realized I could use what I'd learned to help others." Joe closed the notebook and looked up at Frank, his expression unreadable. "Why are you telling me this now?" Frank's eyes glistened with unused tears. "Because I wanted you to know that your courage, the way you stood up to me, changed my life. And I wanted to thank you, properly this time." The café was silent as the two men sat across from each other. Patrons who had been watching the exchange from a distance held their breath, sensing the significance of the moment. After a long pause, Joe reached across the table and placed his hand on top of Frank's. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said softly, echoing the words he had spoken years ago. Frank's shoulders sagged with relief, and he nodded. "Thank you, Joe, for giving me a chance to be better." A celebration of unity. Later that evening, the café hosted a special event, a community storytelling night. The space was packed with people from all walks of life, each bringing their own tales to share. Mike and the bikers occupied their usual booth, their laughter filling the room. Sarah, now a co-owner of the cafe, moved between tables, ensuring everyone had what they needed. Joe sat at the front of the room, a microphone in hand. The crowd quieted as he began to speak. "I've lived a long life," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "And I've seen this world at its best and its worst. But what I've learned is that people are capable of incredible change, even when it seems impossible." He glanced toward Frank, who sat quietly near the back, his expression a mix of humility and gratitude. "This cafe," Joe continued, "is proof of that. It's a place where we come together, where we listen to each other's stories, and where we find common ground. And that's how real change begins, not with grand gestures, but with small steps, one after another." The room erupted into applause, and Joe smiled, his heart full. As the night went on, people took turns sharing their stories, of hardship, of triumph, and of the ways they had grown. Each story added to the tapestry of Ashwood, weaving together a narrative of hope and resilience. A legacy secured. In the years that followed, Joe's influence continued to ripple through Ashwood. The Patch and Strites Café became a symbol of unity, attracting visitors from far and wide. Schools and community centers began programs inspired by Joe's story, teaching future generations the value of empathy and courage. Joe spent his remaining years surrounded by the community he had helped shape. He watched as the seeds of change he had planted grew into something extraordinary. And when his time came, Ashwood came together to honor him with a celebration of his life, a life that had bridged divides and inspired countless others to stand for what was right. On a plaque outside the cafe, engraved beneath the mural, were the words Joe had lived by. "Change doesn't happen all at once. It's a lot of small steps, but those steps add up." And so, Ashwood moved forward, step by step, carrying Joe's legacy with them, a reminder that even in the smallest places, the greatest changes could begin. A farewell to a legacy. The final years of Joe Thompson's life were a testament to the quiet power of perseverance. The Patch and Strites Cafe thrived as a beacon of unity, and Joe became a beloved figure not just in Ashwood, but across the region. Visitors came to hear his story, share their own, and experience the cafe that had become a symbol of reconciliation and progress. Joe often sat in his booth by the window, a familiar sight to the regulars. His presence was a comfort, a reminder of how far the town had come. Yet, as his years advanced, he began to step back from the spotlight, content to watch the seeds he had planted grow. The farewell gathering. One crisp autumn evening, Joe's closest friends and the community gathered at the cafe for what would be his last public appearance. The event, dubbed a Night of Gratitude, was organized by Mike and Sarah to honor Joe's contributions to Ashwood. The cafe was filled with laughter, warmth, and the hum of shared stories. Joe, now moving slower but still sharp, sat at the center of it all, his medals gleaming faintly under the soft glow of the cafe lights. Mike stood at the front of the room, raising a glass. To Joe, Mike said, his voice thick with emotion, "A man who taught us that courage doesn't always look like charging into battle. Sometimes it's sitting in a cafe and saying, 'I belong here.' That courage changed all of us." The crowd raised their glasses, echoing, "To Joe." Joe, though humbled by the attention, raised his hand to quiet the room. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but softer than it once was. "I never thought my fight would become something so big. But seeing all of you here tonight, I know it was worth it. This cafe, this town, you've shown the world what's possible when we listen, learn, and stand together." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Joe simply smiled, his heart full. He felt at peace, knowing the town was in good hands. The final morning. A few weeks later, on a quiet Sunday morning, Joe passed away peacefully in his sleep. The news spread quickly through Ashwood, leaving the community in a state of quiet mourning. The cafe, which had become his second home, closed its doors for a day of remembrance. Mike and Sarah took charge of organizing a celebration of Joe's life. The event drew hundreds, including dignitaries, veterans, and people from neighboring towns who had been inspired by Joe's story. The ceremony was held in the Café, where Joe's presence was felt in every corner. A large photo of Joe in his military jacket stood at the front, surrounded by flowers and tokens of gratitude. Guests shared stories of how Joe had touched their lives, each one painting a picture of a man whose quiet strength had left an indelible mark on everyone he met. The memorial and the legacy. In the weeks that followed, the Café commissioned a permanent memorial to Joe. A bronze statue of him, seated at a booth with a cup of coffee in hand, was placed in the cafe's corner. The inscription read, "Joe Thompson, a soldier, a neighbor, a catalyst for change. He taught us that small steps can lead to great strides." The mural on the wall was updated to include the cafe's transformation, with new additions depicting the community standing together in solidarity. Joe's favorite quote, "Change doesn't happen all at once. It's a lot of small steps. But those steps add up," was painted in bold letters beneath it. Ashwood moves forward. The years rolled on, and Ashwood continued to thrive. The town became a model of progress, with its story inspiring other communities to confront their own prejudices and divisions. The Patch and Stripes Café remained the heart of it all, a place where differences were celebrated and everyone was welcome. Frank, who had worked tirelessly to make amends, became a regular at the café. He volunteered his time mentoring young people and sharing his story of redemption. Though some were slow to trust him, his actions spoke louder than his words, and over time, he became a valued member of the community. Sarah, now the sole owner of the café, ensured Joe's legacy lived on. She established a scholarship fund in his name, supporting young people in Ashwood who embodied the values Joe had stood for: courage, empathy, and determination. The enduring light. Years later, on another golden autumn morning, a young boy walked into the café, tugging at his mother's hand. His wide eyes scanned the room, landing on the statue of Joe Thompson. "Who's that?" he asked. His mother knelt beside him, pointing to the inscription. "That's Mr. Joe," she said. "He's the reason this place is here. He taught us all how to be better." The boy stared at the statue, then at the mural, his face lighting up with curiosity. "I want to be like him." His mother smiled. "Then start with the small steps." The café bustled around them, filled with life and laughter. Outside, the town of Ashwood stood as a testament to what could be achieved when courage met compassion, and small steps became a movement. And though Joe was no longer there to see it, his legacy burned brightly in the hearts of those he had inspired.